Japan just gave Ukraine an all-seeing eye in the sky that's going to transform its approach to its war against Russia. Putin is shaking in his boots, and he should be. Thanks to Japan, Ukraine can now hit Russia harder than it ever has before. And it all comes down to 3 words: synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. On April 22nd, Japan announced that it had agreed to provide satellite intelligence to Ukraine via its SAR satellites. That intelligence would add to the geospatial satellite imagery and data Ukraine was already receiving from other nations, and the move represented a huge shift in Japan's cooperation with Ukraine. The New Voice of Ukraine noted this in its report on the decision, quoting the Deep State monitoring group as saying, "This is the first ever step of this level of cooperation from Japan. The data will be provided by the Japanese Institute IQPS. These IQPS systems have been integrated into the intelligence platforms used by Ukrainian military intelligence, or HUR, and they will be responsible for providing battlefield imagery, the likes of which has only been seen in a limited capacity before." How? Well, to answer that question, we first need to dig into what SAR is. According to ISI, SAR works differently from traditional satellites. These other types of satellites are essentially sent into orbit around Earth, equipped with powerful cameras they use to take pictures. That makes them vulnerable to the elements. If there's cloud coverage, a regular satellite can't break through to get a shot of the ground. Plus, the images returned, though often high quality, are also zoomed out to a point where it's difficult to spot specific pieces of equipment or vehicles beyond simply confirming that they're in the location the satellite is aiming its camera at. SAR changes the game. ISI says a SAR works by sending discrete radar pulses from an antenna built into the satellite directly to the ground. These pulses create echoes, with each of these echoes creating data that is fed back to the satellite. From that data, the satellite can form high-definition images of the Earth's surface, regardless of whether there's cloud coverage or some form of obstruction that would block a traditional satellite from taking a picture. Reporting on Japan's decision, YouTuber Wes O'Donnell says that SAR is like sonar for satellites, and the image it generates not only offer better clarity than a traditional satellite image, but are also more up-to-date. When you compare 2 SAR images over the same location over time, you can spot changes, tire tracks, shifted soil, even vehicles moving under camouflage. Ukraine gets to see it all, meaning Japan has just provided what may prove to be the most vital weapon Ukraine has in its arsenal for fighting against Russia. Putin's forces can't hide anymore. They can't obscure their vehicles or rely on the weather to move equipment. Ukraine's new all-seeing eye can spot it all as it happens, meaning Russia faces a direct response whenever it tries to do anything. As for how Japan got its hands on this technology, it all comes down to internal innovation. The concept of SAR is nothing new. However, it's expensive to implement, with ISI pointing out that a single SAR satellite can weigh as much as 2,204 pounds. Getting one into the skies is a challenge, never mind launching a full array. But Japan's IQPS has already overcome that problem. According to the Japanese government website, IQPS is one of only 5 private companies in the world that has managed to develop, operate, and capture images with SAR satellites that are far smaller and thus more cost-effective than those ISI mentions. Each IQPS satellite weighs just 220 pounds, costs a fraction of the price of a larger SAR satellite, and is still able to capture images with a resolution of just 18.1 inches. That's close enough to ID specific vehicles, tents, and military hardware. And thanks to SAR, Ukraine can now ID all of that stuff, regardless of whether it's a clear day or its territory is being buffeted by a snowstorm. It makes no difference. Any time, be it day or night, Ukraine can see exactly what Russia's troops are doing on the ground, thanks to Japan, IQPS, and SAR. And IQPS will soon have plenty of these satellites in the skies. On March 14th, Rocket Lab confirmed that it had completed the successful launch of a SAR on behalf of the Japanese company. More importantly, according to Space News, Rocket Launch added that this launch was the first of 8 that it is under contract to deliver to IQPS. 6 of those launches are scheduled for 2025, meaning Ukraine's new eye in the sky is only going to get stronger this year. The other 2 are scheduled for 2026. The March launch also followed a separate launch of an IQPS SAR satellite in December 2023, meaning that by the end of 2026, Ukraine will have around 10 of these satellites generating battlefield imagery for it. And it gets worse for Russia. Japan isn't the only country that has given Ukraine access to SAR technology. United 24 media reports that Ukraine is already working alongside several of its other allies, including Germany, Italy, and Finland, to get SAR images. In the latter case, Finland provides access to ISI SAR tech, meaning the very company we use to explain how SAR works is providing direct support to Ukraine. The 3 countries we just mentioned have all been providing direct military aid to Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion. According to the Kiel Institute, Germany has committed 18.44 billion euros in aid, the majority of which is military. Italy and Finland are lesser donors, though they've still given plenty, 1.59 billion euros from Italy and 3.17 billion euros from Finland. All three have also contributed as part of their membership in the European Union. The organization has given over 138 billion euros to Ukraine so far, more than the United States, with another 122 billion euros still to be allocated. Japan has been generous too. It currently ranks 5th, behind the US, EU, UK and Germany as Ukraine's largest donor. However, the difference here is that almost none of what Japan has provided has been direct military support up until now. Japan has provided $1.74 billion in humanitarian aid, along with about $10.6 billion of financial aid, says the Kiel Institute. Now it's delivering images from satellites that it knows Ukraine is going to use for direct military purposes. And that brings us to why Putin is so scared of what Japan just gave Ukraine. It's not just about how powerful SAR satellites are, though they are impressive enough to have Putin shaking in his boots. It's also about what this decision means for the Ukraine war going forward. That all starts with SARs being the latest in a line of direct military support Japan is now providing to Ukraine. That support is growing. Since Putin invaded Ukraine, Japan has slowly but surely enmeshed itself with Russia's enemy. Beyond its substantial financial commitment, Japan held the Group of Seven, or G7, presidency throughout 2023. In that role, it ensured that the G7 nations, which also include Canada, Italy, Germany, France, the UK and the US, kept their eyes on the prize when it came to Ukraine. For instance, Japan's former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida asserted his nation's support of Ukraine by holding a state visit to the country, the first visit any Japanese leader has made to a conflict zone since World War II, according to Denton's. Fast forward to February 2024, and Tokyo hosted the Japan-Ukraine Conference for the Promotion of Economic Growth and Restructuring. That conference marked another evolution in the bilateral relationship between the two countries, resulting in more than 50 cooperation documents between both public and private sectors in each being signed. Support has continued to increase. In August 2024, the Polish Institute of International Affairs reported that Japan had become the first non-NATO member state to sign a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine. Again, this marked an evolution in the relationship. Under that agreement, Japan said it would provide Ukraine with non-lethal arms, along with humanitarian and economic assistance, in addition to engaging with Ukraine in deeper dialogue surrounding security issues that affect both nations. Though Japan was already providing much of this type of aid to Ukraine, having it enshrined in paperwork was another shot to Putin, as he had to deal with yet another nation formally placing itself in Ukraine's corner. More recently, we've seen other signs that Japan's support of Ukraine is growing stronger. On April 16th, United 24 Media reported that Japan will provide 30 new military vehicles to Ukraine, 6 of which had already been delivered on April 10th. That added to the 101 vehicles Japan had already donated, with all 6 being Mitsubishi Type 73 light utility vehicles. Again, we see Japan sticking to its guns when it comes to providing non-lethal military equipment. But we also can't ignore the fact that these vehicles have a military purpose. More on that in a moment. On May 8th, news of even more Japanese support for Ukraine broke out. This time, Japan provided Ukraine with high-precision tools designed for the inspection of damaged transport infrastructure. These tools are vital. Every bridge, road, and railway Russia is able to destroy hurts Ukraine's logistical network. Being able to assess the damage done to this transport infrastructure is the first step in figuring out how to fix it. The point here is that we see a clear pattern. Japan, for so long a nation that has tried to maintain neutrality when faced with global conflict, is putting its full weight behind Ukraine. That's bad news for Putin. It means a country that is still a key power broker in the Indo-Pacific sees him as a threat that needs to be eradicated. With the access to SAR satellites Japan has just given to Ukraine, we see yet another evolution in the relationship between the two countries. Thanks to this technology, Russian soldiers are going to die. Japan may still not be providing the weapons Ukraine will use to cause those deaths, but it's ensuring Ukraine has every scrap of information that it needs to make its strikes as effective as possible. And that brings us back to the more in a moment point we mentioned earlier. Japan's increasing support for Ukraine, with the SAR satellites being the latest, is indicative of a nation that is undergoing a cultural transformation. Wes O'Donnell touches on this in his YouTube video. This isn't some meaningless goodwill gesture. Japan has never done this before, he says. Not the US, not for NATO, not for anyone, but they just did it for Ukraine. Why? Because Russia's war is changing old habits fast. O'Donnell isn't wrong. We've seen the most obvious signs of these changing habits in Europe, where NATO has just agreed to up its defense spending as a proportion of GDP to 5%. Militaries throughout Europe are building up in preparation for what some see as an inevitable war with Putin and his marauding Russian forces. But Japan would be isolated from that war. Entire oceans separate it from Russia. meaning it doesn't likely have anything to worry about when it comes to Russian attacks on the Japanese mainland. It would have been all too easy for Japan to sit this one out, just like it has done so many times in the past, but it hasn't done that. Instead, as O'Donnell points out, the old habits of Japan are dying hard. Once so happy to play the neutral party, Japan is transforming itself into a military behemoth. Its support of Ukraine is just one sign of that transformation. There are many others, as GIS reporter Riley Walters points out in a May 27th article. Japan is a neighbor to Russia, even with their water-based separation. It's also a neighbor to China and North Korea, both established allies of Russia and key threats to Japan in the Indo-Pacific. As Walters points out, Japan has stood back and watched as China modernized and grew its military. It's seen North Korea, though still fairly isolated, form security partnerships with Russia. Combine all of these emerging threats and you have a strong argument for Japan to revisit the security policies it's had in place since the end of World War II. Key among this revisiting is the creation of a national defense strategy, which sees Japan shift from its decades-long approach of passive defense to a more proactive posture designed to deter potential threats. With that shift comes a marked increase in defense spending. In 2023, Japan spent $48.2 billion on defense. In 2024, that number rose to $55.3 billion, an increase that represents the largest one-year increase in Japan's military spending since 1952. Article 9 of Japan's constitution, which emphasizes that the country will never use war as a means of self-defense, is starting to be left in the dust. After all, there's no other reason why Japan would have bought 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the US for $2.35 billion if it wasn't serious about showing certain countries, Russia very much included, that it's ready for a fight if it has to be. Japan has also been busy on the security cooperation front. Beyond the previously mentioned security agreement with Ukraine, it signed reciprocal access agreements with several other countries, including the UK, Australia, and the Philippines. The US is also a key security partner, with Walters pointing out the US and Japan have also intensified their talks on deterrence, focusing on America's extended nuclear protection for Japan. These dialogues are now held regularly between high-level officials, including at the ministerial and secretariat levels. The point here is simple. Japan has become much more than a silent partner to Ukraine that delivers humanitarian and financial aid while avoiding getting its hands dirty. Yes, Japan hasn't agreed to send weapons to Ukraine yet, but it's clearly preparing for a fight, and it may not be long before Japan sees Russia as such a massive threat that it starts sending weapons into Ukraine, along with supporting equipment like vehicles and the intelligence gathered from its array of SAR satellites. Speaking of those satellites, let's bring our analysis back to what Japan's decision means for Ukraine. In early March of this year, following a disastrous meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump at the White House, the US cut off Ukraine's access to its satellite intelligence network. The cutoff didn't last long. Within a few days, the US reversed its decision. Still, that short period without access to US satellite imagery showed Ukraine how dependent it had become on the US to provide the intelligence it needed to carry out strikes against Russian targets. Ukraine is still receiving intelligence from the US at the time of this video's creation. However, we've added that little disclaimer because America's actions in March demonstrated that the relationship between the US and Ukraine was on fragile ground. That's not to say that the US will conduct an intelligence cutoff again. The March incident seemed designed to teach Zelensky a lesson and bring him to the table to discuss a ceasefire. But the US could switch off intelligence sharing again, and if it does, Ukraine needs to be ready with alternatives. That's where the SAR satellites from Japan and Ukraine's previously mentioned European allies come into play. All are outside of the US satellite network, meaning a similar decision to that seen in March won't affect the SAR satellites. All will continue to beam images to Ukraine with or without US involvement. And therein lies the point. Japan's latest move is just another step toward making Ukraine less dependent on the US in its battle against Putin's forces. Is it enough for Ukraine not to need the US at all? No. A Ukraine backed by the US is always going to be stronger than one that's fighting without the help of America. What we see with Japan's SAR is the creation of a safety net, along with an extremely useful intelligence tool that will allow Ukraine to continue conducting strikes against Russia with or without the US. Ukraine is even pushing further in this direction when it comes to the space-based aspect of Putin's war. On June 23rd, Space News announced that Ukraine has joined up with a consortium of Eastern European and Nordic countries with the goal of raising $115 million. That money would go towards the creation of a constellation of over 70 imagery satellites, none of which are under US control, that Ukraine can use to monitor the battlefield. Named Intermarsat, this new constellation would orbit Earth at an altitude of 310 miles, says Space News, allowing it to provide daily images of the area between the Baltic and Mediterranean seas, an area that includes Ukraine and even parts of Russia. Japan's SAR is just one of a series of space-based moves that will allow Ukraine to detach from the US if the time ever comes when it needs to do so. Finally, there's one more reason why Putin is so terrified of Japan's SAR satellites, and it's a reason we touched on earlier. Those satellites are already connected to Ukraine's military equipment. This isn't just about spying, O'Donnell says in his analysis video. SAR data now flows straight to Ukraine's drone operators, artillery planners, and HIMARS crews. It tells them where the Russians moved under the cover of night, where a rail convoy just parked, where fresh trenches got dug yesterday. In other words, Ukraine is getting access to almost real-time battlefield intelligence without having to jump through any hurdles. It doesn't have to wait for Japan to get the satellite images before they're beamed over to Ukraine. There's no worry about Japan potentially holding images back, so Ukraine doesn't have the full picture. This is the complete integration of a SAR satellite system that allows Ukraine to react to everything Russia does almost as soon as it does it. Russia doesn't have anything that comes even remotely close to comparing. Sure, it has SAR satellites of its own, as O'Donnell notes, but they're older, slower, and about as subtle as a dump truck in a ballet class. They also don't revisit areas anywhere near as frequently as the IQPS satellites Ukraine just received access to. That means their images are often out of date within days, forcing Russia to wait for a revisit before it can update its own strategies. Therein lies the real problem for Putin. Thanks to Japan, Ukraine can now stay several steps ahead of Russia at all times. Soon that advantage will manifest as more attacks on key Russian positions, weakening Putin's offensives as his invasion drags deeper into 2025. And if all of this wasn't bad enough for Putin, he's also dealing with losses on a scale that even he is afraid to admit. Find out what we mean in our video explaining how Russia's casualty rate may have already put victory out of reach for Putin. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.